I never believed blood could stain paper until the night my sister died, and the crimson seeped into my hands like ink, thick and accusing, telling me that the truth I once chased with notebooks and interviews was now chasing me back with a ledger of its own, a book that seemed older than time, bound in cracked leather and carrying within it the names of men who thought themselves gods. Men who thought they could erase lives with money, violence, and silence. But what they had not counted on was me, Ivy Cross, once a journalist of words, now a woman of shadows. And the first thing you must understand is that before I began crossing names from the ledger, I had to let go of the person who believed in justice. I had to bury her beside my sister, and all that remained was something harder, sharper, and merciless. The night it happened, the city was drowning in rain, neon bleeding across puddles, the kind of night where newsrooms smelled of cheap coffee and broken deadlines. But I was not in my newsroom anymore, no. I was in the morgue staring at a white sheet that failed to cover the violence beneath it, my sister's lifeless face marked with bruises and terror, and I was told it was a mugging, a random act, something meaningless. But the moment my fingers brushed her cold wrist, I knew better. Because her hand clutched a scrap of paper so tightly that the police had missed it. And when I pried it free with trembling hands, I saw it was a torn page, a fragment of something larger, a name scrawled in elegant handwriting, a name I recognized from the city's business elite. A man untouchable, a man the newspapers called a philanthropist. But I knew then that this was not random, this was not chance, this was a message. You see, journalists are trained to connect dots, but that night the dots felt like drops of blood leading me somewhere I was not ready to go. Still, I followed them, because grief leaves you with nothing but the hunger for answers, and that hunger carried me to an abandoned library on the east side, a place I remembered from an old investigation, a place rumored to be where the city's power brokers once met in secret, and beneath the dust and forgotten shelves I found it, the ledger, massive, bound in scarred leather, with pages thick as bone, each line written with a precision that chilled me, names, dates, locations, verdicts written not by courts but by shadows, and my sister's name was there, written beside the word erased. That was the moment Ivy Cross the journalist died, and Ivy Cross the Crimson Ledger was born, though I did not call myself that yet, not until later when the city whispered it in fear. But standing in that library with the smell of mold and memory choking me, I realized I was holding the true history of the city, a history of murders disguised as accidents, suicides, drownings, overdoses, all tied to the same web of names. And I realized my sister's blood was not spilled in vain. It was spilled to reveal this book to me, to give me the weapon I needed. And with trembling fingers, I tore out the page with her name, slipped it into my coat, and swore I would not stop until every name in that ledger was crossed out in crimson. The first night I chose to act, the rain had given way to fog, thick and heavy, muffling the streets like the city itself was holding its breath. And I followed the first name, a banker whose reputation glittered like glass towers, but whose ledger entry revealed he had ordered the silencing of whistleblowers in his company, one of them a young woman who had drowned mysteriously 3 years ago, and I knew his time was up. So I waited outside his penthouse, the fog cloaking me as he stepped from his sleek car, umbrella in hand, arrogance in his stride, and I moved with the silence of the dead, pressing the torn page of my sister into his palm as I whispered her name, watching his eyes widen in terror as recognition struck, because they all knew the ledger, they all feared its keeper, they just never imagined she would come back in flesh and bone. He begged. They always beg, but words are meaningless when weighed against blood, so I dragged him into the fog, into the silence, and when the city woke the next morning, they found his body by the river, his lungs filled with water, though there had been no rain, and beside him a page, his name crossed in crimson, the ink still wet, and whispers began to ripple through the alleys and boardrooms. Whispers of a ghost, a reckoning, whispers of the Crimson Ledger. But you must understand this was only the beginning, the first entry in my own book of vengeance. And as I sat alone in my apartment staring at the stolen pages pinned across the walls, I realized that with each name I erased, I was writing a new story. Not for the newspapers that once silenced me, not for the city that forgot my sister, but for myself. A story written in shadows and blood. And I knew I would not stop, not until the final page of the ledger was filled, Not until the last name was crossed. Not until the city bled truth from its gilded veins. I had crossed out the first name, and though the city only whispered of accidents and strange deaths, I knew the truth. I knew the ledger was beginning to balance, and in that balance came a silence that should have comforted me, but instead only sharpened my hunger. Because the moment you take a life for justice, you discover it does not fill the emptiness inside. It only carves it deeper, demanding more, demanding that every name in the book be given its proper end. And so I stood before the pages scattered across my wall, each name glowing like a scar in the dim light, and I told myself that fear would be my ink, terror my punctuation, and that the story of Ivy Cross the journalist had ended, replaced by Ivy Cross the ledger keeper, a woman the city would soon learn to fear. The second name belonged to a judge, a man who had smiled across courtroom benches and sworn oaths beneath the flag, but whose ledger entry revealed the truth, that he had buried cases, silenced victims, and traded verdicts like currency, his decisions costing lives while his pockets overflowed with bribes. And I remembered him clearly from years ago when I had been investigating corruption in the courts. I remembered the way his hand had rested on my arm too long, the way he dismissed my questions with a smirk. And I remembered the young boy who had been sentenced unjustly under his gavel, a boy who later took his own life, another erased entry in this crimson archive. And so I followed the judge with patience, learning his patterns, waiting for the moment the city would hear his final sentence. At night, his house glowed with chandeliers and hollow laughter, the kind of place where power dined with itself. But what the city did not know was that in his study he kept his secrets bound in files, papers that never reached courtrooms, names that disappeared from evidence lists. And one night, as he sat in his leather chair sipping brandy, he found a new file waiting for him on his desk, a file he had never placed there, a file containing his own name, his photograph, his ledger entry copied in crimson ink. And when his eyes widened, I stepped from the shadows, silent, unblinking, and whispered the words his victims never had the chance to say. He begged too, they all beg, but this time I gave him the choice he had denied so many others. I placed before him a scale, one side empty, the other holding the bullet that would end his life, and I told him to balance the scales himself, to decide his own verdict. And though his trembling hand tried to tip justice back in his favor, it was too late, because the scales had already been written, and by dawn the newspapers reported his death as a suicide, a judge overwhelmed by scandal. But in the shadows the truth spread, that another page had been crossed in crimson. The city began to talk, not openly, not yet, but in hushed tones, in cautious glances, people whispering of a ghostly hand rewriting history, of names once untouchable now falling like dominoes. And though the police formed task forces and the mayor issued statements, none of it mattered because the names in the ledger were their names, their allies, their patrons, and they could not chase me without chasing themselves, so they turned their fear inward, suspecting one another, unraveling their alliances. And I watched with quiet satisfaction as the powerful began to taste the very paranoia they had fed to the weak. The third name was harder not because I doubted, but because it belonged to someone I once trusted, a woman, a mentor from my days in the newsroom, someone who had taught me how to chase truth, how to never let silence bury the story. But the ledger revealed she had been feeding names to the very men we had been investigating, selling leads for protection, betraying whistleblowers whose deaths were written in neat lines beneath hers, and betrayal cuts deeper than violence, because it stains the good memories, it poisons the past. And as I followed her through the familiar streets near the press building, I wondered if some part of her had once been honest, or if every kind word had been just another page in their book. When I finally confronted her, it was not with fury, but with sorrow. I placed the ledger page before her, showed her the names of the people who had died because of her, and she did not deny it. No, she simply sighed as if she had been waiting for me, as if she knew her time had come, and in her eyes I saw a strange relief, the kind of relief that comes when the mask can finally be lowered. And though part of me longed to forgive, the crimson in my veins would not allow it, because forgiveness is another form of silence, and silence is what killed my sister. So I marked her name, crossed it slowly, deliberately, and left her body in the newsroom archives where she had once claimed truth lived, her final byline written in blood. With every name I crossed, I felt myself slipping further from the woman I had been, the journalist who believed truth was enough, and yet I did not mourn her because Ivy Cross the reporter was powerless. Ivy Cross, the ledger keeper, was unstoppable, and as I moved through the city's underbelly, as I left behind a trail of crimson signatures, I began to hear the whispers grow into rumors, and the rumors into legend. They called me the Crimson Ledger, a ghost with a pen dipped in blood, and the irony was not lost on me. For I had always wanted my words to matter, and now they did. But only because they were written in lives, not ink. But power never yields quietly, and soon the ledger began to push back. The names in its pages grew bolder, more dangerous, and I found myself hunted, cameras flashing in alleys, men in dark suits following me at a distance. My apartment ransacked while I slept on rooftops. And one night as I returned to my hidden library, I found a message waiting for me, not written in the ledger but scrawled across the wall in dripping red paint. "We see you, Ivy." They knew my name now, not just whispered in alleys or muttered in smoke-filled boardrooms, but spoken aloud in meetings where fear laced every sentence. They called me the Crimson Ledger, as if I were a myth, a phantom stalking their nights. But what they did not understand was that I was not hiding in shadows anymore. I was already inside their world, inside their blood, because with each name I crossed off the ledger, I came closer to the truth. And that truth was sharper than any blade, heavier than any bullet. It was the name I had avoided reading since the first night, the name written at the bottom of the page where my sister's entry had been, the name tied not to strangers or mentors or judges, but to me. The storm that week was relentless, rain hammering glass towers until their reflections drowned in the streets. And as the city slept beneath its electric sky, I pieced together the fragments I had gathered. Photographs, files, whispered confessions torn from the last breaths of dying men, and all of it pointed to one figure. A man who had sat quietly at the center while others played their games. A man untouched by scandal, admired by newspapers, quoted by presidents. The man who had built the trust that funded charities, hospitals, scholarships. The same trust that had hidden the ledger for decades. And in the shadows of that name I found the truth. He was not just another conspirator. He was the author, the architect, the one who had begun writing this crimson history long before I was born. His name was engraved not just on the ledger, but on the city itself, carved into buildings, printed on programs, whispered like a prayer at galas. And when I let my eyes rest on it, I felt the ground tilt beneath me, because it was not just his name, it was mine, Ivy Cross. Bloodline to the man who had built an empire of erasures, the man who had ordered my sister's death to keep me from discovering the truth, the man who was my father. The realization cracked something inside me, not because I had lost him, he had been lost to me long before, but because the ledger was not just a record of crimes, it was a legacy, and I was written into it. My existence, a sentence he had tried to erase, and for the first time since the night my sister died, I felt doubt claw at me, whispering that I was no better than the names I crossed, that perhaps the ledger was not a weapon I had stolen, but a destiny I was fulfilling, page by bloody page. Still, I could not stop, destiny or not. The final entry had to be written. And so I prepared, not with rage, not with fear, but with the calm of inevitability. I dressed in black, tucked the torn page of my sister into my pocket, and walked into the storm, letting the rain wash the last traces of Ivy Cross the journalist from my skin, leaving only the ledger keeper behind, a woman who had accepted her place in the story. He lived in a mansion that sat above the river like a crown, glass walls revealing a kingdom of wealth. And when I entered, I did not sneak. I did not crawl through shadows. I walked through the front door and let the storm announce me. Thunder rolling as his guards reached for weapons that never fired, because I had already turned their loyalties, already whispered into their ears that the man they served would erase them too when their usefulness ended. And so they stepped aside, leaving me to climb the marble stairs alone, leaving me to face the author of the ledger in the study where he waited, pen in hand, as if he had been expecting me. He did not flinch when he saw me, did not deny what he had written. He simply smiled, the same smile I remembered from childhood photographs. And he told me the ledger was never about evil. It was about order, that every empire needed sacrifices. That truth was too dangerous for the weak, and he told me I was proof, that I was his finest entry, the daughter who had become his successor, the Crimson Ledger itself. For a moment, I almost believed him, almost saw myself through his eyes, a legacy, not an enemy. But then I thought of my sister, of the cold sheet in the morgue, of the names scattered across my walls. And I realized he was wrong. I was not his legacy. I was his ending. I placed the ledger on his desk, opened it to the last page, and slid the pen toward him, telling him to write his own entry, to decide how his story would be told. But he refused, his pride too heavy, his belief in his own immortality too strong. And so I took the pen, pressed it to the page, and with steady hand wrote his name, crossing it with the same crimson line that had ended so many others. And when he reached for me, when his voice rose in protest, the storm silenced him, lightning splitting the sky as I pulled the trigger and the ledger drank his blood. When it was done, I did not feel triumph, only silence, a silence deeper than any storm, heavier than any death, and I realized the ledger was complete. The final entry written, the story finished. But in that silence, a new question grew. If the ledger was closed, what was I now? Was I free? Or was I just another erased name waiting to be forgotten? I left the mansion as dawn broke, the city rising unaware that its history had been rewritten in one night. And I walked to the river where it all began, the torn page of my sister still in my pocket, and I set it on the water, watched it drift away until it sank beneath the surface. And for the first time, I let the crimson ink wash from my hands. But whether it was absolution or surrender, I could not say, only that the city would never know the truth, only that the legend of the Crimson Ledger would live on, a ghost in the margins, a story told in whispers.